Sahana vavatu, Sahano bhunaktu, Saha vidyan karavavahai, Tejasvinavadhitamastu ma vidvishavahai. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Chaitanyam sarvagam sarvam sarvabhutaguhashayam yat sarva vishayatitam tasmai sarvavide namaha. Very good. Welcome back. From our last class, you figured out that this is not an introductory class. That was a very sophisticated subject matter that we worked our way through in a prior class. And one reason I'm bringing this up is that when I'm looking around our hall here, I think most of you have sufficient background in these teachings. If I'm thinking about our online viewers, I read all the questions that come. And some of the questions, even on Upadesha Sahasri, are basic questions. And what I would suggest is that if you don't have a really strong background in the teachings of Advaita Vedanta, it would be worthwhile to make some effort to catch up a little bit for the sake of these more advanced classes. And in particular, there's a set of videos called Introduction to Vedanta. That would be an excellent way to begin. Also, there are certain topics. Today we're going to be talking about karma, doctrine of karma. So if you're not well versed in the doctrine of karma, there's a series of series of videos on that as well. Anyway, enough said, so that we can handle this subject matter. The current chapter is called Tattva-jnana Swabhava Prakarana. Can we see that title? Tattva-jnana Swabhava Prakarana. The chapter on the Prakarana means chapter. On the Swabhava, the nature of Tattva-jnana, knowledge of reality. And somehow the title doesn't quite capture the content of this chapter, because in this chapter, Sri Krishna, I'm thinking Bhagavad Gita. This is our Upadesha Sahasri class. So Sri Shankaracharya addresses a particular question in this chapter. And you've heard me say again and again, the purpose of Vedanta is to free us from suffering. We suffer in part because of karma. Past karmas can affect us in this life, bring suffering into our lives. And these teachings remove ignorance. Do these teachings remove karma? The karma that causes suffering. So this is going to be our inquiry today. And in order to proceed, we need to remember we need to understand in general the doctrine of karma, but in particular, the three primary categories of karma. I want to go to the board, push the right buttons here, and just remind you, and again, I'm presuming that you've already studied the doctrine of karma properly. If you haven't, you can go and watch my videos on the doctrine of karma. But we need to understand the difference between three kinds: sanchita, prarabdha, and the last one goes by two different names. I'll explain them both. Kriyamana, also called agami. Okay, what do these words mean? Three different kinds of karma. Sanchita means accumulated karma. So from an infinite number of prior lives, you have accumulated by now an infinite amount of karma. That and good karma and so-called bad karma. that infinite accumulation of karma is called sanchita karma. Of course, for this particular life, this life cannot be the result of an infinite amount of karma. If this life were the result of infinite karma, you'd have to live for infinity. That's not possible. So, what is taught in the doctrine of karma is that a portion of the sanchita karma is the cause for this life. That portion is called prarabdha. So, I'm not sure what English word to use for that. It literally means that which has begun, but that doesn't really capture the meaning. The best translation of prarabdha is prarabdha. We'll just stay with that. So those karmas which are fructifying now in this life, that finite amount that will keep us alive until we've exhausted, when this prarabdha karma gets exhausted, your life naturally comes to an end. The final part, kriyamana, literally means being done. And agami refers to future. And both of these refer to karmas that you commit in this life. So this is the accumulation of past karmas. The portion of past karmas that give rise to this life are prarabdha, but in this lifetime you continue to do willful actions. Those willful actions are karmas, and those karmas that you do in this life, they are kriyamana, they are being done. They are also agami, they will yield their fruits in the future. That's why these two words are used. So, with this in mind, we need to understand these three kinds of karma. Shankara is going to presume in this text that you understand these three kinds of karma well. So, with that introduction, we can see our text. Good. Aham pratyaya bijam yata. Aham pratyaya bijam yata. Aham pratyaya vatstitam. Aham pratyaya vatstitam. Naham pratyaya vanhyushtam. Naham pratyaya vanhyushtam. Katam karma prorohati. Katam karma prorohati. In the last line, karma is the subject of this verse. Go up to the top. That karma is aham pratyaya bijam. Bijam means seed, and in a sense of cause. So the bijam, the seed, the cause for karma is aham pratyaya. Aham pratyaya means thought. Aham is the Sanskrit pronoun I. The I thought is called here aham pratyaya. More commonly, we call it ahankara. These two words are synonyms, aham pratyaya or ahankara. We translate loosely as ego. Literally means the I thought, the sense of I-ness. The sense of I-ness that every ignorant person has. Everyone who's not enlightened, their lives are driven, dominated by that aham pratyaya, that ego, the one who says, I am body, I am mind, that I. The I who identifies with the body and mind is that aham pratyaya, and also not just identifies with the body and mind, the I who says, I do things, the I who said, I came to class today, the I also who says, I experience things. I experienced the class today, which means that I is both the karta, the agent of action, and that I is also the bhokta, the experiencer. So that I, the aham pratyaya, the I thought, is both the karta, the agent of action, and the bhokta, the experiencer. Remember, we're discussing an unenlightened person at this point. For an enlightened person, it is utterly different. We'll see that. So, this karma is born of the aham pratyaya. As I just said, please don't sit in the back row. I can't see you. Please sit up front. Okay. So, karma is born of the aham pratyaya. As I just said, that aham pratyaya is the karta, the agent of action. When you say, I came to class, that is the agent of action. That is the ignorance-born ego who says, I came to the class. And that karma is aham, second line, aham pratyayavat sthitam. It is sthitam, it abides, aham pratyayavat, like the ego, like the aham pratyaya, like the ahankara. The ahankara abides where? In the mind, right? I thought, feeling of individuality, the sense of I-ness. So all of that is in the mind. So the karma, he says here, is sthitam. It abides in the mind just like the aham pratyaya, just like the ego. What he's saying here is the whole process of being engaged in karma is a mental process. And what's so interesting and so significant is that your true nature as sat-chit-ananda Atma is utterly separate from those actions and activities. Your true nature as sat-chit-ananda Atma is not an agent of action, doesn't do anything. Now, that you'll see the significance of that as we go along. So, for the unenlightened person, in the mind is both the agent of action and the action itself, that willful action. And remember, willful action is what gives rise to karma, and karma phala, the results. Karma means action. Karma can either be willful or not willful. When actions are not willful, they don't produce this so-called karma phala, the delayed results of actions, which can fructify later in this life or in the future life. Those results are the results of willful karmas and not accidental karmas, things that you do inadvertently. When a doctor bangs on your knee with that hammer, you get that reflex action. Suppose you kick the doctor. That's not a bad karma, because it wasn't a willful action. So we're talking about willful actions. The locus of all willful actions is your mind. That's the first half. Second half. Na aham pratyayavanhi ushtam. Shankara's language here is it's both poetic and sophisticated. This is why Shankara is such a great figure in the tradition of Advaita Vedanta. So that aham pratyaya, the subject of our sentence is still karma. And the karma, which is vanhi ushtam, it is burnt in a fire. What do you mean karma is burnt in a fire? What kind of fire? Na aham pratyaya. Naham pratyaya. Means the opposite of aham pratyaya is naham pratyaya. which means the ignorance-based notion of I, the limited individual I, that ego. The ego is destroyed by na aham pratyaya. I am not that. Now it'll make a little bit more sense if we speak about it in slightly different terms. Instead of with regard to the ego, let's shift the commentator does this very nicely. And he shifts the perspective to the mind. Ordinarily, you are identified with your mind. Whatever happens in the mind, you say, I did it. So you chose to come to class today. That decision took place in your mind. Notice that, I said before, did consciousness decide to come to class today? Consciousness doesn't think. Consciousness doesn't decide. Consciousness is what reveals your thoughts. Consciousness is what reveals the decisions that take place in your mind, but that consciousness itself is not engaged in these actions. These actions are manasa karma. They are mental actions. They take place in your mind, and when you're identified with your mind, then the actions taking place by your mind, you identify yourself as the agent of those actions. In fact, you are that consciousness. As consciousness, you don't do those acts. It's your mind that does the actions. Suppose you really get this, which means, suppose you really get it that your mind, in American English, does its own thing. How's that? Your mind does its own thing. It is an organic computer, correct? In fact, you've heard the terms hardware and software, so it's called wetware. They use that term, hardware and software, and this one is wetware. It's an organic computer. It does its own thing. You're not doing it. It's like the metaphor, you may have heard me give this metaphor before. The electricity inside a computer doesn't do anything. Because of the presence of electricity, the computer works, but it's the computer that does the work. Electricity, they call it potential energy. Potential means it doesn't do anything, it's just potential. It aids. It allows action to take place. So this is our metaphor. If I have the science a little bit wrong, I apologize, but that's not our point. It's the computer hardware and software that function. Electricity doesn't count. Computers are counting machines, right? The computer hardware and software counts. Electricity doesn't count. So in the same way, your wetware mind is an organic computer involved in thinking and decision-making and acting, committing karmas. But consciousness, the consciousness which reveals the activities of your mind, including thoughts, decision-making, and the execution of actions, that consciousness, which is your true nature, is not engaged in action. This is knowledge. Not any kind of knowledge. This is the kind of knowledge we get from Vedanta. It is atma-jnanam, knowledge of the true self, atma. Knowledge, as you know, destroys ignorance. And that's the metaphor used here, that this naham pratyaya, this understanding or knowledge that I am not my mind. I am pure consciousness, independent of the mind. That knowledge, ushtam, it burns karma, vanhi, like fire. It is the fire of knowledge. We call it jnana-agni. Jnana-agni, jnana-agni, the fire of knowledge. Some of you remember in the Bhagavad Gita, I wrote it down here, chapter 4, verse 37, Sri Krishna says, Jnana-agni sarva karmani bhasmasat kurute tata. Sri Krishna says this Jnana-agni, this fire of knowledge, bhasmasat kurute, it burns to ashes. What does it burn to ashes? Sarva karmani, all actions. The fire of knowledge burns all karmas to ashes. Now, how does that work? Well, first of all, it depends on which kind of karma, right? So go back to the board. Go back to the board here. So, this fire of knowledge burns all karmas. According to Sri Krishna, this sanchita karma gets burnt. According to Sri Krishna. According to Sri Krishna, according to reasoning, according to our understanding, the kriyamana or agami karmas also get destroyed because this knowledge removes your identification with the mind. So you are no longer an agent of action. Your mind is the agent of action. If the mind is the agent of action, if you are not the agent of action, then what happens to these kriyamana karmas, agami karma? You don't commit anything. An enlightened person truly commits no actions. Of course, that leads to several questions which are going to come up in the text. So the Shankara concludes here, since the fire of knowledge destroys identification with the mind, and along with destroying identification with the mind, this fire of knowledge destroys that sense of agency. I did it, gets destroyed. And when that sense of agency is destroyed, you are no longer an agent of action, which means the agent of action is the one who receives the results of karma. Just karma 101. If you do the karma, you get the results. If I do the karma, I get the results. It doesn't work any other way. But if there is no agent of action, who gets the results? And that's what Shankara concludes. He says, after that fire of knowledge has destroyed identification with the mind and has destroyed the sense of agency, Shankara says, Katam, how? Karma prarohati. How can karma yield its results? How can karma be fruitful? How can willful karma be performed by an enlightened person? And here we have to say, an enlightened person commits no karma whatsoever. Of course, then you ask, oh, wait a minute. We presume the teacher is enlightened. Teaching is a karma or no? Teaching is a karma. Then how does the teacher teach? And my guru had his stock answer for this. When he would be asked, Swamiji, why do you teach? He said, because you ask me. Which means it's not a willful action. It is prompted by nature. The ones asking the question are part of nature. We're going to see this more. Why and how an enlightened person truly commits no actions. We'll see that in the next verse. Let's proceed. Drishtavat ched prarohasyan, drishtavat ched prarohasyan, nanya karma sahishyate, nanya karma sahishyate, tannirodhe katam tat syat, tan nirodhe katam tat syat prachamo vastaduchyatam prachamo vastaduchyatam. Remember from prior prior chapters, PP and S. PP means Purva Pakshi, the objector. S means Siddhanti, the one replying to the objection. So PP introduces an objection. S introduces the response to the objection. And this is the typical style that Shankara and all the great teachers have used. So, the objector says, Drishtavat chet proroha syat. He says that karma indeed, proroha, karma for and the context is an enlightened person. I mentioned before this is not an introductory text. One of the hallmarks of a more advanced text is terseness. What Shankara wants to do is convey very lofty teachings in just a handful of verses. This chapter is just 5 verses. So in his handful of verses, and every verse is just some 32 syllables. So in his very short span, Shankara wants to convey some very lofty teachings. And to do so, lots of words are left out. For example, the word karma. Here. So karma prorohaha. Karma syat. Karma would yield its, karma does yield its results, drishtavat, because it is seen. Chet introduces the objection. If this is a case, or since this is a case, that it is seen that enlightened people perform actions which have results. For example, if an enlightened person is teaching, we presume there are results from teaching. You understand. To understand is a result of teaching. Or the example the commentator and everyone else gives is in years ago, the so-called enlightened ones would go out begging for alms. So the tradition was that a sannyasi would stand in front of a home and call out, Bhavati Bhikshan Dehi. O mother of the home, please give me alms. When that was said by an enlightened person, that was apparently a karma. Does that karma yield a result? Well, when she brings him food, that's the result. So this is for an enlightened person who does the act of begging and receives the result, which is food. This is the objection. So how then can you claim, as Shankara did in a prior verse, that the enlightened person does no action and receives no results? Pretty good objection, which he manages in just a quarter of a verse, and the response comes. Shankara likes to be terse. His first response is na. This is his typical, in fact, in commentaries, Shankara will give you the 1-word answer, then a 3 or 4-word answer, or maybe 2-word answer, and then he'll go on for paragraphs explaining in greater detail. That's his style, next style. So, first of all, he says, na, that is not true. Why? Saha anya karma ishyate. Saha ishyate, it is proper, it is the fact that that is anya karma, that is a different kind of karma. Different kind of karma means we have to remember those 3 kinds of karma. Go back to the board. So you presumed that when the sannyasi says bhavati bhikshan dehi, you might have presumed that's kriyamana karma. After all, he's saying it, he's doing it. But here, Shankara says, no, it is not kriyamana karma. It is anya karma. It is a different kind of karma in particular. And here Shankara presumes that you understand the doctrine of karma thoroughly, because you have to understand it is prarabdha karma. It is prarabdha karma that causes the enlightened person to beg for alms. How does that work? Does an enlightened person experience hunger? Yes. Based on the hunger, wouldn't it be natural in the wetware, in the mind, for the thought to come, bhavati bhikshandehi, give me food? But that can arise. That act of begging for food can arise in the enlightened person, not born of desire-based will. This is conventional life. Conventional life is you want something and you use your will to get it. Or you want to avoid something and you use your will to avoid it. That's conventional action. An enlightened person is freed from desire. An enlightened person, according to Shankara in the prior verse, is even free from willful action. So then you can begin to understand how it is that the enlightened person can say, bhavati bhikshandehi, give me food. Please give me food. This is not a desire-based willful action. It is as natural as hunger. Hunger is natural. Asking for food is natural. It's a product of the mind. It is not a willful action done by a conscious being who's identified with the mind. That identification is gone. So it is said then, we can understand then, that the actions of an enlightened person are not driven by desire and will. The actions of an enlightened person are driven by the unfoldment of prarabdha karma. This is taught in many, many places. Shankara doesn't elaborate on it too much here because he presumes you've already studied this before. But that leads to the next question. And what is the next question? So PP, again, we get another objection. He says, Tannirodhe, when that is destroyed, when that ego is destroyed, when that identification is destroyed, we're talking about the enlightened person. When the ego is destroyed, when the identification with the mind is destroyed, katam tat syat. How can there be action? How can, so the objector doesn't quite get it yet. How can the enlightened person act? Prachamaha, we ask you this. Vahatat uchitam, tell that to us. How is it that an enlightened person performs action? Back to the board. He's asking, how does an enlightened person perform kriyamana karma? And the answer is, an enlightened person doesn't. And that's confusing because from the outside, can you tell the difference? If you're watching a person, can you tell if the action is willful or spontaneous? How can you tell? Without being a mind reader, you can't tell. Which means you really can't tell if a person, through observation, you can't tell if a person is enlightened or not. Same principle applies. Behavior doesn't indicate enlightenment. So when you see a person act, you don't know if those actions are willful deeds based on desire or whether they are the spontaneous, natural actions of an enlightened person. By the way, spontaneous, natural actions, you all remember the, actually it's the story that comes from the Buddhist tradition where the master tells his student, before I was enlightened, I used to chop wood and and carry water. And he says, now that I'm enlightened, I chop wood and carry water. So from the student's perspective, the student doesn't see anything has changed. But from the enlightened person's perspective, everything has changed. Why? Before enlightenment, the chopping of wood was driven by fear of coldness. Before enlightenment, fetching water was driven by fear of thirst. That fear is gone. There's no more identification with the body. So therefore, if the body is cold, the body is cold. If the body is thirsty, the body is thirsty. How does it affect me, pure consciousness? Not at all. This is a perspective of an enlightened person. So prior to enlightenment, chopping wood and carrying water was driven by fear and desire. Desire for warmth, desire for water. After enlightenment, those actions go on. They're no longer driven by fear. They're natural. They're spontaneous, effortless. You get water and chop wood because it needs to be done. It's part of nature's unfoldment, and that's from the Buddhist perspective. Same from the Vedantic perspective, although we would add that it's natural and spontaneous. We would simply add driven by prarabdha karma. Now, in what sense prarabdha karma? Well, he's going to explain in the next verse. How did you get a body in the first place? The answer is prarabdha karma. And that's what the next verse says. Let's see that. Dehadyarambha samartyad Dehadyarambha samartyad Jnanam sadvishayam tvayi Jnanam sadvishayam tvayi Abhibhuya phalam kuryat Abhibhuya phalam kuryat Karmante jnanam udbhavet Karmante jnanam udbhavet. So how does this happen for an enlightened person? Deha adi, body, etc. Arambha, beginning. That which causes the beginning of the body, etc. Body, mind, senses. Samartyat, because that, and the topic here is prarabdha karma. That prarabdha karma has the samartyam, the power, the capacity to cause the arambha, the beginning of dehari, of the body, etc. And again, this Shankara presumes you understand the doctrine of karma well, and it's based on the fact that after you have exhausted your karmas for this life, you die. Then the question comes, why do you get reborn? And the answer is up on the board, because you have an infinite amount of sanchita karma. But as I said, the infinite sanchita karma can't give rise to a particular birth, because a particular birth is finite in length. A finite life cannot be the result of infinite karmas. Therefore, it is a portion of those infinite karmas that give rise to this life, called prarabdha. So, because of the capacity of prarabdha karma to cause the birth of this body is natural. It is the natural result of these karmas. This body naturally gets hungry. And when the body naturally gets hungry, for an enlightened person, it's natural to get food. That's all natural, not driven by desire, not driven by willful action. So Shankara explains here, and this is a little bit tricky. I think we can get this. We have to see We have to see the next verse also to understand this. Shankara says that because of that prarabdha karma, your knowledge of Atma, second line, jnanam, your knowledge, which is sad-vishayam, knowledge of reality, knowledge of truth, tvayi, the knowledge that you have, the knowledge that dwells within you, that knowledge, abhibhuya, is a tricky word. Literally, being overpowered. Your knowledge gets overpowered, and palam kuryat, that prarabdha karma yields its result. According to Shankara, prarabdha karma has the power to overcome your knowledge and yield its result. Now, this goes back to you remember the context. Shankara started out by saying that knowledge destroys all karma. But here we have the exception. There's always an exception. So this knowledge apparently doesn't destroy prarabdha karma. Of course, consider the consequences. Suppose when you got enlightened, so go back to the board, when you get enlightened, your sanchita karma gets burnt up, according to Sri Krishna. When you get enlightened, kriya-mana karmas come to an end because you're no longer identified with your body and mind, you're no longer an agent of action. But that knowledge does not destroy prarabdha karmas, the karmas that caused your birth. And here, imagine that prarabdha karmas did get destroyed when you became enlightened. What would be the consequence? Prarabdha karma is what keeps you alive. Your heart goes on beating because of prarabdha karma. You go on breathing because of prarabdha karma. If enlightenment means the destruction of prarabdha karma, as soon as you got enlightened, you die. So it makes sense that prarabdha karma will not be destroyed by this knowledge. There's the metaphor, you all know the 10th man story. I'm not going to tell the 10th man story. Anyway, the idea of that story is this boy, this lost, the 10th man, is running through the forest looking for himself. Remember the story? And as he's running through the forest, looking for himself, he runs into a branch and smashes his head and has a big gash on his forehead. As the story continues later, he learns that he is the one that he was looking for, right? So when he is enlightened now, in the metaphor, as to who he was, what happens to the gash in his forehead? It's still there. So notice that gash overpowers his knowledge. So that gash represents the prarabdha karmas, which are not removed by knowledge. On the other hand, so the enlightened person then will still, the enlightened person's body and mind will continue to be affected by prarabdha karma, which is a good thing, as we said. Otherwise, that body and mind would drop immediately after enlightenment. But what we can say is, in spite of what happens to the body and mind, there's no more suffering for the enlightened person, right? There's still hunger, there's still pain, but no more suffering for the enlightened person, because there's no more identification with the body and mind. The hunger belongs to the body, pain belongs to the mind. The enlightened person knows nothing affects me. And Shankara now finishes this verse, karmante, when that prarabdha karma comes to an end, jnanam udbhavet. This could be badly misunderstood if you don't follow the commentary. It literally says when prarabdha karma comes to an end, knowledge arises. Don't take it literally. Knowledge arises when you understand something. Here, the knowledge is no longer abhibhuya, overcome by prarabdha. Karmante, when your prarabdha karma comes to an end, whether you're enlightened or not, the consequence of karma coming to an end is you die. When you die, you might be subject to rebirth. When an enlightened person dies, they are not subject to rebirth. Therefore, for the enlightened person, karma ante, when their prarabdha karmas come to an end and the body dies, jnanam udbhavet, what remains is just consciousness. What happens to pure consciousness at the moment of death? Nothing. And further, that consciousness will not get re-identified with the body and mind again, because identification requires a body and mind. If there's no rebirth of a body and mind, then there's no possibility of future identification and no possibility of future suffering. So here Shankara is referring to videha mukti, the status of being liberated after one dies. Now, that abhibhuya, that idea that, let's go back to the board, and we want to answer a question. Why is it that this knowledge can destroy sanchita karma, bhasmasat kurute, Sri Krishna says, that sanchita karma is destroyed, and also this knowledge destroys kriyamana karma for a different reason, right? Removing that identification with the body and mind, removing that agency. So the question remains, why and how is it that this prarabdha karma escapes being destroyed by knowledge? And Shankara addresses that in the next verse. Arabdasya phale hyete, arabdasya phale hyete, bhogo jnanam cha karmanaha, bhogo jnanam cha karmanaha, avirodhastayor yukto, avirodhastayor yukto, vaidharmyam chetarasyatu, vaidharmyam chetarasyatu. Yes, Shankara is just brilliant here. He's talking about arabdasya karmanaha. Connect those two words. First and the end of the second line. Arabdasya karmanaha. Of karma, which is arabdha. You can guess arabdha means prarabdha. He says, for this prarabdha karma, he says, phale hi ete. Shankara says there are ete. For our grammar students, dual number. Could be plural. Here it's dual. Ete phale. That's clearly dual. There are two different kinds of results. Prarabdha karma has two different kinds of results. Remember, karma has phala. So for prarabdha karma, there are two kinds of phala. What are those two kinds of phala? One is bhogaha, which here means experience. When you get a body and mind, you experience your life. That is bhoga. And the other result, surprisingly, Sri Shankara says, jnanam, knowledge, is the second result of prarabdha karma. That's unusual that Shankara says it here. In what sense? Now, you already understand that knowledge is a result of these teachings. We call it Vedanta pramana, the means of knowledge called pramana. But here, Shankara is saying that not only is worldly experience the result of prarabdha karma, but also knowledge, enlightenment, is a result of prarabdha karma. In what sense? Now here we have to understand, again, very, very terse. To read this without a commentary, you won't get the right meaning. So here's what we understand. How do you get a guru? How do you gain access to scriptures? Does everyone gain access to a guru and scriptures? How to explain why some people have access to guru and scripture and other people don't? Mera karma aisa hi hai. It's just the way my karma is. So it's commonly understood that based on your karma, you may or may not get a guru, you may or may not have access to scripture, and further, even if you have access to a scripture and guru, you may not have adhikaritvam, preparedness, mental preparedness. And I think you'd agree that the ability to gain adhikaritvam is also the result of good karma. So as a result of good karma, you gain a guru, you gain access to scripture, and you gain preparedness. In this way, Shankara says that knowledge is the result of prarabdha karma, not the direct result, the indirect result. So now he makes this, this is somewhat of a unique argument. I don't remember seeing this anywhere before. Maybe it's elsewhere, but I don't recall seeing it before. So Shankara says here that because prarabdha karma has these two results, both worldly experience and knowledge, he says, therefore, in the third line, yuktaha, it's understood that tayoho avirodhaha, that the two are not opposed to each other. That is, knowledge is not opposed to prarabdha karma. Knowledge is not opposed to prarabdha karma because knowledge is a product of prarabdha karma. What he's explaining back to the board is that prarabdha karma is not destroyed by knowledge, even though sanchita karma is burnt in the fire of knowledge, kriyamana karma is burnt in the fire of knowledge, prarabdha karma is not burnt in the fire of knowledge. Why not? Shankara says, because that knowledge is a result of prarabdha karma. The knowledge which is a result of prarabdha karma cannot destroy prarabdha karma. This is Shankara's argument. It's quite subtle. It's an interesting argument. So he explains in this way why prarabdha karma continues to exist for an enlightened person. On the other hand, last line, 2, but on the other hand, that ch4, you have to break those two words apart. Itarasya, for the other kinds of karma, vaidharmyam. Boy, he is so terse here. They are different. There is a complete difference for the other kinds of karma. What are the other kinds of karma? Back to the board. Other kinds of karma are sanchita and kriyamana karmas. So Shankara says, itarasya, for these two other kinds of karma, there is vaidharmyam, incompatibility with knowledge. So in this verse, Sri Krishna, I'm still stuck on Bhagavad Gita. In this verse, Sri Shankara explains that enlightenment, this jnana-agni, this fire of wisdom, can destroy sanchita karma and kriyamana karma. It does not destroy prarabdha karma, which, as I said, is a good thing, because if you became enlightened and enlightenment destroys your prarabdha karma, finished. Ho gaya. Okay. last verse. And the last verse is like praise of this knowledge. Let's see that. Dehatma-jnana-vajnanam, Dehatma-jnana-vajnanam, Dehatma-jnana-badhakam, Dehatma-jnana-badhakam, Atmanyeva bhavet yasya, Atmanyeva bhavet yasya, sanechannapi muchyate. Sanechannapi muchyate. You have to connect the words jnanam at the end of the first line and yasya at the end of the third line. Yasya, one for whom, jnanam, knowledge. What kind of knowledge? Back to the third line, atmani eva bhavet. One who gains knowledge, atmani eva, about one's true nature. One who gains knowledge of Atma, one who becomes enlightened. But what kind of knowledge is it that is enlightenment? And this is Shankara's point here. Let me just explain it, and then we'll see the words. In one way, you all have knowledge. You all have understood my words. You all speak English. You have understood, at least in a general sense, what I have been teaching. And it means that you have all understood in a general way the highest teachings of Vedanta, tatvamasi, which we saw in a prior verse, prior class. So if you have understood all this in a general way, why are you not yet enlightened? Presuming that you're not. Again, as I said, from behavior, how can I tell? I have no idea. I could be teaching a room full of enlightened people. How would I know? You're not going to raise your hand and say, Swamiji, I'm enlightened. You're not going to do that. Okay, sorry for being a little silly here. So, for one who has gained knowledge, but what kind of knowledge? He says this knowledge which is first line, dehatma-jnana-vat. Knowledge which is like dehatma-jnana, knowledge which is like your identification with the body and mind. Let me explain what Shankara means by that. When your knowledge that I am sat-chit-ananda atma, utterly independent of this body and mind, Shankara says, when that knowledge is as firm and convincing as your prior knowledge was. What was your prior knowledge? I am this body and mind. Previously you thought, this is me. What you see is what you get. That's your prior knowledge. How firm is that knowledge? It's pretty firm, right? Identification with the body and mind is extremely, deeply rooted. You have lived with that erroneous knowledge your entire life. It has spread its roots throughout your mind, throughout your thinking. So, what Shankara says here, when your self-knowledge, when your knowledge of Atma is as strong as your prior ignorance, your ignorance-based identification with your body and mind. Let me try to paraphrase him more exactly. When your identification of yourself as sat-chit-ananda atma is as strong as your prior identification with yourself as being your body and mind, and when that knowledge, second line, dehatma-jnana badhakam, when that knowledge completely destroys, badhakam, when it completely destroys your identification with your body and mind. Dehatma bhava is the condition where atma is deha, body and mind. So when that ignorance-based identification with your body and mind has been completely removed by knowledge that's as clear and strong as your prior identification with your body and mind was. He says, then saha, that person, muchyate, becomes liberated, becomes enlightened, na icchannapi, even if they don't desire it. A very funny expression. They become enlightened whether they want to or not. Now, it's a curious expression. What is he talking about? What does that mean? You become enlightened whether you want to or not. Remember, this whole chapter we're talking about jnana-agni, the fire of knowledge. Fire burns, whether you want it to or not. You put your finger in a candle flame, and if you don't want to get burned, it doesn't change anything. The candle flame still burns. It's not a matter of will. Fire burns. In the same way, knowledge is not a matter of will. Knowledge destroys ignorance, whether you want it to or not. And what Shankara is doing here is to praise this knowledge by saying this jnana-agni, this fire of knowledge, is so powerful that whether you want it to or not, this fire of knowledge will remove your identification with your body and mind. It'll put an end to this willful actions driven by desire will come to an end, and in this way you will become freed from karmas in this life, those kriyamana karmas, because that sense of agency, the drive of desire will have disappeared, the identification with the body and mind will have disappeared. Also, your sanchita karma will have been burnt by that jnana-agni. And finally, your prarabdha karmas will still play out, but without causing suffering. Final point, and that is prarabdha karmas bring suffering to lots of people. But for an enlightened person, the prarabdha karmas bring problems for the body and mind. The enlightened person has long since ceased to be identified with the body and mind. So the problems of the body belong to the body, problems of the mind belong to the mind. The enlightened person knows, I remain utterly unaffected by the problems of the body and mind. And that's a nice place to end our class today. We'll see chapter 5 next week. Om Sarve Bhavantu Sukhinaha Sarve Santu Niramayaha Sarve Bhadrani Pashyantu Ma Kaschid Dukkha Bhag Bhavet Asato Ma Satgamaya Tamaso ma jyotirgamaya mrityor ma amritangamaya. Om shanti shanti shanti. Om. That's very nice.